Hi, today the book I'm reviewing is called The Tyranny of Growth by Malcolm Ray. This book caught my attention with the caption, Why Capitalism Has Triumphed in the West and Failed in Africa. When I saw that, before I bought the book, I sat a lot and thought through, has it really failed in Africa? What do we mean by this? It really piqued my interest. So I definitely recommend this book for anyone interested in economics, in growth, in GDP, in capitalism, and how it intertwines into an African and South African context. I found it quite fascinating. It is a lot. There were times in the book when the economics got quite a lot for me as well, but stick through it. I think coming into the present, it really wove a great story path, and I always enjoyed my history classes, but compared to what we learn, compared to what we read and consume, this was a fascinating account, to say the least. Praises for The Tyranny of Growth that really stood out for me, again, was one by Professor Lorenzo Fioramonti. He says, in this brilliant book, Malcolm Ray gives us an original and fascinating account of the destruction, impoverishment, and destitution caused by the obsession with economic growth at all costs. Not only does he unpack the dark sides of growth with a mix of journalistic clarity and academic precision, but he also reminds us that this approach to development was imposed on Africa by the West, with little or no caution regarding its adequacy to social, cultural, environmental, and human dynamics of the continent. As a result, African countries have grown unequal, unstable, unhealthy, and more dependent than ever on outside powers. And that's what got me thinking even more is we've just accepted capitalism as the way. There's a lot of talk now on the well-being economy, multiple stakeholders, not growth at all costs. And always find it interesting to look at history and what has brought us to this point with the different opinions. And this book really does shed a lot of light on that. Another item that caught my attention was by Dr. Edith Dankwa. And she writes, Malcolm Ray has written an electrifying expose of the sleuthing employed by the United States before, during, and after the Second World War to expand its economic interests in our beloved continent, Africa. It is not that we in Africa do not experience the brutal consequences of what has become known as economic growth. It is that we have come to accept it as a measure of progress. And that's the important part. Why have we accepted it? Why is it that that is what highlights and shows economic progress and what we measure growth on? To continue, here is a book with sobering new information filled with historical documentation, the individuals, the hidden numbers, the secret motives brought to life in a historical narrative of legalized plunder on a scale that would test even the most fertile imagination. Against this background, Ray leaves us questioning the goals and priorities we have set over the past 8 decades. And that is it. I tend to have a very fertile imagination, and this gave me a lot to think about. It took me a while to get through the book, but it really is because you consume so much of information to then reflect, think, introspect, research a bit more. I found it absolutely fascinating. The book takes you through a journey from the 1930s, which Malcolm calls the origins of the growth myth. So that's where it started. We then go from the 1930s to the 1950s, for which he has classified as part 2 for the weaponization of growth during Franklin Roosevelt's time period. Very fascinating. Part 3 is then from the 1950s to the 1960s, where we go into Africa, and then bandit capitalism from the 1960s to the 1970s. Thereafter, we're into Part 5, New Age imperialism between the 1970s up to 2000, and the tipping point, 2008 to 21 and beyond. I'm now going to read a few extracts. 26 years after the end of apartheid, and I am sitting in my study trying to understand why the vision I shared with so many other activists has become a nightmare of gaudy opulence and grinding poverty, of grand larceny and social exclusion, of crass materialism and dispiriting alienation, and of cronyism and the allocation of economic and job opportunities. The basic error, in my judgment, I know now, is that black economic empowerment, that hoary antidote to racial inequality, is only really a byword for plunder, self-enrichment, and elitism, the legacy of the growth at all costs market supercult. Stripped of its rhetorical legerdemain, its social consequences are not dissimilar of the tragedies that befell the poor in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, under Mobutu Sese Seko's Zairenization purges during the 1970s, Nigeria under the brutal kleptocracy of General Sani Abacha in the 1990s, and Zimbabwe under the indigenization regime of Robert Mugabe during the 1990s and early 2000s. As an older generation in South Africa dies, institutional memory fades and new mythologies become accepted verities, so much so that even the erstwhile black courtiers of apartheid capitalism, the BEE protégés who amassed small fortunes prostrating themselves before the old oligarchy, entered our democracy heroes. Paradoxically, those who dared to stand for an inclusive and non-discriminatory society became the villains in the new South Africa. So pervasive was this falsification of history that, as the former South African intelligence chief, Mo Sheikh, once ironized to me, it is hard to find a single collaborator in South Africa today. To Sheikh's dry reference to collaborators, I would add an uneasy courtship of elites who did absolutely nothing, and when it was over, still expected everything in return. As I sit here reflecting on the discontent and despair around me, I can't help but wonder what a tragic defeat was immersed in our victory on that fateful day in April 1994. I see, instead of liberation, the bitter legacy not just of apartheid, but of an elite nourished in its womb. The difference between apartheid and the new South Africa, the venerable doyen of black empowerment, Sam Mutsuyena, said to me in 2011, is that there was no state largesse to loot before 1994. He might have forgotten his own protégés in black business who did just fine during apartheid, and once the state was finally captured, after apartheid too. Beneath their pious morality lies a kinship with the new ethos of elitism. Their path to ill-gotten gains, bled of virtually all truth, has been mythologicized. Much like other African elites, their infamies fawned over by the media as success stories to be emulated by new generations for whom bleeding the economy dry now seems to be their insurance against the future. So this is the start and the author's note of the book, and from here you delve in throughout history, building up into capitalism, the GDP growth targets, how it was set, how it was introduced into Africa, and where we are today. I think it's quite intriguing, and the author then ends off back in South Africa, back home, and I'll read a few final extracts for you from there after he's painted the entire scenario throughout history. My own experience as a journalist has taught me that participants in stories do not act out storylines according to a scripted narrative. Their actions are more often than not messy, irrational, and emotionally overwrought outcomes of evolving cultural, social, and political landscapes. It is the evolution of an extra-legal landscape, or what has been called the informal economy, that has had a long frontier with the legal world, a place where inhabitants of London Road have taken refuge because the cost of obeying the law has outweighed the benefit. Just as night consumes day, So, with most of humanity, they seem condemned to live in what Time magazine once aptly described as the eternal present. We see people stepping outside the law because they are not allowed inside. And when the term invasion is contemplated, the question will arise whether a strong element of survival rather than illegality is not concealed in the silent frontier battle. Yet the fate of the formal and informal economies has remained entangled, with cruel disappointment for the latter born of the failure of the former. The irony is that places like Alexandria grew up because the rest of the growth economy failed. It had created so many wants and shortages that the basic instinct to survive literally drove a shadow economy. During the interminable build-up of the COVID-19 pandemic, I never found the questions about it easy to answer, and the manner in which countries argued with themselves seemed wholly inadequate to the causes and scale of the economic crisis. I wanted to go see past the abstractions to what growth means in people's lives. Where, I wondered, do places like Alexandria lie between the official definition of growth and prosperity on the one hand and the informal one on the other in the matrix of social justice? As I reflected on London Road, I came to see, like the novelist Annie Proulx's take on America's economic backwaters, that an evolving frontier is not something to be viewed through a policy lens defined by economic growth, but rather it is to be felt on the ground. In the act of narrative journeying, the place isn't something people move through, but rather experience. It is an alternate reality in which the poor can't escape the consequence of the growth economy, so they push out the frontier. They appear to invade. And that really summarizes this book quite well. Lots and lots of food for thought. It is quite a big, heavy read, but very eye-opening. Some very intriguing concepts here, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So definitely in my recommendation list for books to read in 2023, especially if you're fascinated by economies, capitalism, history, evolution, bit of politics, and as I said before, specifically around the African continent. You can grab your copy. I bought mine from Take a Lot, so I'm sure you'll find it there. Let me know if you've read the book and if you've enjoyed it, also what you're currently reading. Thank you.